Let's run a hospital the way Disney runs Disneyland, for the delegate and for the patient.
I'm Dr. Louise Messara. Welcome to Season 4 of the Future Health podcast, Future Proof, a podcast about the future ways we will work, the work we will do, and the impact of technology and scientific innovation on the future of the healthcare industry. We have a fantastic lineup of guests this season as we cover topics ranging from life-saving cars to robot lawyers and even diagnostic t-shirts. So go ahead and like, share, or subscribe now so you don't miss a thing. The year was 2016. I remember sitting on the edge of my seat in an arena in Dublin, wearing a glowing wristband I'd just been handed by organisers. I was surrounded by 2,000 equally excited, equally illuminated audience members. It was an electric feeling. The closest I'd come to experiencing this sort of energy before was in 1994, when in an earlier career, I found myself assistant producing a charismatic TV evangelist live show at the Royal Albert Hall. The crowd that turned up was so big, thousands in excess of the 11,000 who had tickets. The riot police were called to attendance. People were so determined to be part of the experience that they were fainting or feigning fainting en masse just to get in. Midway through the show, I snuck into the hall from backstage to sit in amongst the audience. Something was going on. It was almost like the group were breathing together. It was that same strange but thrilling communal energy coursing through the crowd in Dublin. But this time, I wasn't in the audience sharing in a spiritual awakening or waiting for Coldplay to bound out onto the stage. I was at a critical care conference. So what virus had taken over the critical care community? It was called SMAC, the Social Media and Critical Care Conference. And it was an entirely new way of delivering medical thought, education, and inspiration to an audience that couldn't have been more susceptible to infection. I'm Dr. Louise Messara, and this is Future Proof. Dr. Roger Harris is a distinguished intensivist and education revolutionary. Roger works at Royal North Shore Hospital ICU and is one of the founders of a series of education interventions, from the Bedside Critical Care Conference to SMAC to CODA. Roger is here to talk to us about creating a movement and building and activating a community. Now, in the intro, I've made it sound like everyone who attended SMAC in Dublin was under some sort of drug-induced hypnosis. Perhaps we should start with you telling the audience a little about how you and your colleagues pulled off a medical conference that sold out in the same length of time as Pink's Australia tour. I want to take you back to the conversations you were having with your colleagues, must have been, 10 years ago or so, around the time you decided to try something that was really radically different. What was it you were trying to solve for? What were the problems you were trying to change?
So I guess at the time we were working online, working across a few social platforms in delivering education in engaging ways. We were sort of interacting almost on a daily or hourly basis with our audience. And in that process, we were at the same time attending medical conferences, in particular the sort of standard college education sessions, and all of that interaction was missing. And I think what we were finding online was that there was more passion and more engagement online than there was in person, which is sort of contrary to what you would expect.
That's right.
So I guess that's where it started. We, as education, people interested in education, was like, how do we get that engagement and how do we get that passion back to the more conventional medical meeting? And so it's sort of working in reverse. You know, most medical conferences look to socials and podcasts and things to boost the medical event. We'd started in the socials and online, and now we were coming back in the other direction.
So the minute you decided to make a change, you'll have been, you've been in this game for a while now, you'll have been faced with the resistance that just comes with any innovation. I suppose, what have you learnt about the approach you need to take to sidestep sort of naysayers or make your way around institutions in order to sort of make the change happen?
You need to be resilient in the first instance, because it's really quite hard and relentless trying to move forward, often when there is a lot of resistance to change. And certainly in the medical conference space, still to this day, there's enormous resistance to change. So you need to set in to some extent for that. And I think you need to be prepared to, look for alternative strategies that are going to get you, as you said, sidestep around some of those obstructions. What's sort of interesting, I think in my younger self, I really felt like we had to move in a certain direction. There was an objective that we were looking to achieve, and any sidestep was worthwhile to get to that objective. I think probably in my older self now, I would be a bit more cognizant of, sometimes in some of those sidesteps, you have to be careful of what the collateral is, and particularly if you're burning any bridges, that they're not bridges that you might want to cross on the way back.
It's a bit of a balance between the burning the bridges and just having the patience to sort of take it through usual channels. There's a real tension there, don't you think? Massive tension.
And I think, let's be clear, when you're up against that sort of resistance, you can't go through usual channels. It's just not an option because it's a glacial pace to get anywhere. So to actually have real innovation, you have to be disruptive. But I guess what I'm talking about, there's a term that I've sort of come to a bit in recent years, which is, disruptive feels like it's destructive as much as it is constructive. I sort of talk about constructive. It's this hybrid word of trying to have constructive innovation. But it has to be disruptive in the first instance because, as I said, the resistance is so big. Unless you break down those barriers with the disruption, there's no forward momentum.
So the SMAC movement was a fast phenomenon, and your followership, the energy that they brought was amazing. Beyond just being reassuring or reassured by that your approach was right and you were onto something, what else have you learned from SMAC's success?
The number one thing we learnt was that in rebuilding the way the conference operated, we deconstructed the whole process. We rebuilt it with the delegate in mind, not the educator. We really wanted to see what were we giving them, what were they looking for, and how can we really engage them where they are in terms of rebuilding it. I think in deconstructing that and really flattening the hierarchy of the education process, making it much more the teacher and the learner were on the same level and there was much more interaction. In doing all of those things, breaking down those barriers, we brought the community very closely together. And in that process, there was enormous trust built between both the delegate and the educator. And that trust really blossomed into all sorts of things because I guess it gave us a foundation for even greater change.
Do you see that you've sort of taken those lessons that you learnt from the sort of conference environment and brought them into your unit? Do you see that sort of the hierarchy changing or evolving in that sort of learning space of by the bedside space as well? Or do you feel like it really is distinct to the sort of SMAC environment that you created? There's
some infiltration of that into the workplace. I think medicine, as you well know, is very hierarchical. But, that also comes back, I guess, to the leadership style. So the leadership style was, very much trying to remove the hierarchy and promote the trust and the interaction. And so, yes, you can't lose that. Once you've been bitten by that bug, you can't let go of it because it is so powerful.
I've heard you talk about sort of learning from leaning into the criticism. That's not easy for everybody, especially in the world that we all work. Tell us what you mean by that and what were, I suppose, how you learnt to really be able to accept the feedback and improve from that.
I guess, particularly say with SMAC was so successful that when we were getting feedback, 90% of it was just overwhelmingly loving and good but it was of little value, because there wasn't much constructive criticism in it. 5% of it was haters who just, they hated everything. They hated the food, they hated the educate, just every single thing. So you could sort of put that to one side too. They just weren't happy campers. And then there was 5% of people who really said, I had a great experience, I would come back again, and it was that 5% that gave really constructive criticism. And sometimes it was, sort of painfully constructive. But what I learned from that was every time we, lent into that painful process and got closer to it, again, the reward on the other side was 10 times better than anything else. It was very,
But
powerful.
It's when, you've got a success, it's still pretty brave to keep taking on the feedback and making a change to something that 90% of people are telling you they're in love with. I don't know, does the sort of need to improve become a bit addictive?
I mean, for me, I feel like it was a bit innate, but I think it's not so much addictive as I just think it's a necessity. I mean, I think, as Buddha said, there's nothing more certain in life than change. And the minute you start resting on your laurels is, the moment you're about to hit the iceberg. In my opinion.
Can we talk a little bit about the relationship between sort of institutional culture and education innovation? I mean, you're lucky to work with some of your sort of SMAC and CODA colleagues in your institution as well. Even if on your reflection, say from sort of pre-COVID, through COVID and now, how the culture of where you're working either makes space or takes away space for innovation, depending on what's going on in the sort of the bigger institution around you?
That's a deep question.
It's a big question.
Big question. And I guess I'd have two parts to that. I think the first is, let's talk about pre-COVID. So, as I alluded to, health in general at all levels of health and across disciplines and professions is very hierarchical. I feel that it's fairly anti-innovation. Now, that's probably true of a lot of big organisations, but say in medicine in particular, we really reward people for slowly putting runs on the board, keeping their head down, and just showing up the whole time. That's what's really rewarded in my view, and there's a lot of good to that, obviously. However, when you look at the people that are coming through in the medical workforce, we know that their creativity is often at its height in their sort of mid-30s. And yet this is when they're finishing specialist training between 35 and 40. This is when they're trying to get a job. And then everything is about being a small target, but also getting runs on the board and building the CV. And so there's no benefit to risk-taking in that environment. As you get older in your career, of course, you lose some of that creative spark, but you become somewhat more creative because you're liberated by the fact that you're not being pushed down by trying to stay, on the elevator. The second part I would say is about COVID. I mean, COVID across everything, including health, was such a disruptor that it did provide opportunities for real innovation, and some of that still exists. So the way we look at things now has been really shaken up on a global massive basis that does allow us to re-examine things all the time.
Do you think you've held with that new spark or the sort of freedom of COVID innovation, or do you feel like you can see it sort of us flipping back to the old normal in terms of
100% back to the old normal?
Okay.
Yeah, it's just what happens. It's
how can we stop that, Roger?
I know. For me, when you talked about it as an addiction, and it sort of is. Once you get the taste of that, you can see how it opens doors, it creates opportunities, and so you just want more of that, and you want to give everyone that opportunity. But a lot of people, I don't think, are built like that. A lot of people want routine. And so sometimes, I noticed in COVID, for a lot of people, the uncertainty was crippling. Yeah. So while it's liberating and creates innovation, at the same time, it was really draining for people because there was so much uncertainty.
It would be nice to see medical professionals or, consultants looking at who the registrars are coming up. It would be nice to see that a new portfolio could be imagined where sort of innovation and creativity wasn't making yourself a big target, but was in fact something that a department was looking for in a trainee, as opposed to what we usually hear, which is, I'm going to be your echo fellow, or I'm going to be your ECMO person, or I'm going to be your education person. You can sort of see a future where maybe there is a new space for a new sort of trainee to be encouraged in that space. I mean, maybe that's just my dream.
No, I love that idea. I really do. I think that we got to build in a few things around that, though. That I think when you are really encouraging people to to take risk and be creative, we have to build the trust that they can fail. And I think that sometimes is as bigger impediment as creating the space in the first place is underpinning it with this really trusting environment where people are encouraged to think, you know what, I can take a risk, I can make a suggestion, I can take an action, and if it fails, I'm not going to be punished for that. And that requires a lot of trust. But yeah, I really love the idea. I'm going to steal that one from you.
You can have
mine.
it. I give it to you. If we just go back to sort of some of the difference of SMAC and that particular idea and movement, there was a real shift. I mean, you know, there were all the pre-conference activities, and there certainly was a lot of academic content, but there was a bit of a shift away from that sort of core scientific knowledge piece into some of the other domains that we're all expected to perform in every day. I'm just wondering how much of that was you and your colleagues' vision, and how much of that was part of that feedback you were receiving from people who were attending. It felt like that element grew and grew and grew.
That was almost entirely from the community feedback. It was leaning into that feedback that really took us down. You know, as an intensivist, I was always very cognizant of the fact that if there wasn't enough scientific evidence and data being presented, that somehow it would be seen as weak. And you know, as you know, I'm adverse to referring to anything in medicine as a soft skill, because I think, you know, the things that we refer to as soft skills, like, you know, communication and, you know, all of the things that are around that, around ethics and things, they're not soft skills at all. In fact, they're the only skills, having done this job for 30 years, that keep me awake at night worrying.
You and I need to coin a new phrase for these things.
They're the
tricky skills. Tricky, hard and harder. Yeah, even harder.
The much harder skills.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's the hard science, and then there's the much harder skills of working in teams and communicating. But, you know, that was the thing, that as soon as we started doing that, the feedback was, you know, yes, we love to get a little bit of the scientific data, and we love practicing airway skills or ultrasound or whatever it was in pre-conference. But when we come together as a group in the main sessions, we want to discuss the really hard stuff that is the stuff we struggle with every day. So
for educational entrepreneurs who are out there listening, you know, we read a lot and we hear a lot that when you're starting a movement, you've got to be able to articulate a very clear vision. And definitely that's the case. But your team has really shown a responsiveness, a flexibility, and a real humility. And I'm interested in that sort of balance between leading and following in the creation of something original. Is it the leaders that have to drive, or, you know, I suppose we've alluded to it already, this sort of followership, leadership balance, it just seems really productive in the sort of that SMAC coder space. What are your reflections on that?
You know, again, I think it comes back to that trust factor, that, you know, you've got to feel in a trusting relationship that the leader, follower is you know, needs to be sort of just interlinked and circular. And that hierarchical structure is, you know, like in a military operation, is not so good in that learning environment. And so, but it requires the leadership to have the confidence and the trust that they can relinquish the power and listen, and then lean into that, and then, you know, take back the power and move forward again, if that makes sense. Yeah, I love that, the way you put that in the leader-follower thing, because I think what we did was completely blur that line and sometimes become the follower rather than the leader.
Another element that was very different about SMAC was obviously just the presentation, style, marketing. I mean, you know, not to have the tears in my eyes, but I was sitting there with multiple devices open to get my tickets. I mean, there was something different about this sort of conference. How much do you feel creativity was a part of the success of the movement?
Oh, massive. You know, like you sort of feel like when you're talking about education, that things like, you know, that word marketing is a dirty word or something, you know, and I think so often in our communication, whether it's with our patients or with our, you know, in this case with our learners, you know, the marketing skills are those hard skills about making sure that someone feels recognised and that they're, you know, they're seen and listened to. And so I think for us, everything we did was trying to identify who our delegates were. How do we pitch things at that spot, whether it was through pop culture, whether it was through, the sort of artistic elements of what we were doing, even down to things like the font and things, what was relevant and important, because every single one of those messages sort of comes together to reinforce that trust. It's like, you're seeing us, you know who we are, and everything you're doing is being pitched at that. So.
And it must have been a super enjoyable outlet for a lot of your colleagues to have a little spurt or an opportunity to be creative in a world where we're not allowed and often to really express that element of our personalities in healthcare sometimes. So I imagine for some people it was a revelation. As
you know, there's so many people in medicine who are creative, and yet their profession rarely intersects often with this other passion. If you can indulge me a moment to tell you, one of the key stories of that would be, one of the most remarkable people I've met in medicine in recent years, a fellow called Kirill Musa, who's a registrar training in intensive care, but he is an intensive care now fellow. He is a ballet dancer, and I just happened upon that randomly on a ward round one day. And he's one of those, beautiful people that just never ceases to surprise you with the depth of what's happening in the background. So, ward rounds don't often offer these opportunities, but somehow something came up and it became clear he was a dancer, and he since danced at the SMAC conference in Sydney.
Wow, okay.
And he was instrumental in the production that you might have seen in Berlin with the aerial dancers, because he was doing aerial dancing with the Sydney Ballet Company. Can you believe it? This is a doctor.
No, you can believe it. Yeah. They're hidden all over the hospital, so it is amazing.
And he was almost in tears saying how that experience of his passion for medicine and his passion for dancing had intersected in this space. And it was so evident. And anyone in the room, those sort of things were evident, because the passion was so rich. It was beautiful.
Yeah, great story. As you, as the program sort of developed, there was definitely a broadening of your audience. You started to see more and more of a sort of multidisciplinary collection of people over the years, and I think that's probably only continued with CODA. I'm just interested in your views about the sort of the healthcare team of the future, and I suppose what the relationship might be between the way we teach and learn together and how we sort of deliver our care in a hospital setting. Were you thinking about that at all, or was it just that what you were doing was so good everyone wanted to be part of it?
No, we're thinking about it. And again, back to feedback. And we were certainly, super aware of constantly looking at who the delegates were. So, when we looked at the delegate profiles, they were between 25 and 45 was sort of the peak age. So I was too old already. But the delegates were, half female. So straight away we were like, well, we have to make sure that half the faculty are female.
Yeah.
And we just set that quota. And then by the time we got to CODA, we were doing a program, and I'd forgotten to even check to see we were there, and we found we'd had 60% female. But every time we made those changes, whether it was bringing nurses and paramedics in, social workers, physiotherapists, all of those different craft groups in, there was massive added value in terms of what they brought to that. And I guess it just reinforced the way we do work in a team, that we were learning in the same way we practice. But interestingly enough, I think one of the things that I really saw evolve out of that was starting to think, well, how do we restructure how we work? Because when we are operating like this, we're all, again, there was no hierarchy. It wasn't who's a doctor and who's a nurse and who's a physio and who's a paramedic. It became more about who can contribute the most to this conversation.
Yeah.
And, it makes me think of healthcare in the future as inventing these roles, not so much around let's run a hospital the way the doctors want to run a hospital, but let's run a hospital the way Disney runs Disneyland for the delegate and for the patient. Let's rethink what they need and what's going to make that experience, the best outcome.
So much more about skills and attributes than roles, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. It can be frustrating. It has been frustrating to me over the years to watch the time taken between sort of what we know is the right thing to do and widespread practice change. Can you give us any advice here today about what's something we can do or some things we can implement from medical school through to the Ministry of Health that can promote that faster translation from sort of research to practice?
Some of that started, I think, and I'd like to think a little bit of it was to do with SMAC and other movements that were happening online at that time. But I think that knowledge translation that you're talking about, I'd even go one step deeper than what you said, is that not only does it take years for that good knowledge to get out, but the worst thing is feels like minutes for bad knowledge to get out.
Yeah.
So, vaccination was the classic for us all, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was killing any of it. We're burning up inside watching this bad information about vaccination, and we can't get rid of it now, and it hangs around once it's out there. Whereas good information takes much longer to sort of disseminate and percolate. But, that nasty word we used, marketing, before has something to play here. So I think in terms of knowledge translation, it's about trying to package information in ways that reach the bedside and, reach the target audience. So whether that's through infographics, whether that's through podcasts, whether it's through the way we give talks, I think that's where we need to put a lot more work in.
Do you think medical schools today are already changing the way or the person we're training to be doctors in the future? Or do you feel that we've still got some way to be redefining, I suppose, the skills and attributes that we talked about earlier, that we foresee in the team of the future? I'm not sure. I haven't been at medical school for a while, but I'm interested in, you might be a little bit closer to the coalface of who's coming through and whether we're attracting as a profession the types of people that are going to be great at the hardest skills, which is sort of what we're going to need doctors to be getting really comfortable with over the next sort of 10, 20 years.
Yeah. I think we're getting better. I think that's definitely the case. I mean, the medical students I meet are ridiculously talented people, whereas I think when I was training, you just had to have an ATAR of 99.9, and that was the only requirement.
Yeah.
And we all know that you just don't need that ATAR. We want people that have certainly got the ability to learn knowledge and manage knowledge, but the way knowledge is going to get managed going into the future is different, right? But those other skills, the even harder skills than the knowledge and skill acquisition, those things I think are things that need a lot of development. And I think through problem-based learning and through a lot of the educational input around communication that students get, it's infinitely better than what I got and probably even what you got. I know you're 20 years younger. But
that would be nice. Thanks.
But yeah, I think it's certainly got better, but I think there's a long way to go still.
Your movement, SMAC, and more so CODA, started to ask really big questions that were outside of the scope of anything we've seen in sort of medical conferences before. It leads me to think that you and your group, your colleagues, have a visionary idea of what the role of the doctor is and could be. I'm going to put you on the spot. It's 20 years in the future. Are we recognising doctors in the same way? Are they having the same role in society as we have today?
In a way, yes. I'd like to think so. I think, we alluded to the fact that, to be anyone in healthcare, we operate off many professional domains. Knowledge and skill is only one of those things. Professionalism, ethics, advocacy, scholarship and learning, all of those other domains, they're all part of our curriculums for ongoing CPD. You wouldn't think so when you go to a traditional medical conference mostly, because they're usually breakfast sessions or breakout lunchtime sessions or something. They're not given the sort of airtime that those things are. But I think going forward that knowledge acquisition is sort of going to get less and less important, presumably, the way artificial intelligence is going, that as knowledge holders we'll be much more knowledge processors, and the sort of things that I learned as lists and mnemonics and things will be gone because
few.
But we'll be holding on to new skills. We'll be using new parts of our brain to process those complex issues. But really, for medicos, most of us go into healthcare because we want to help people, and in my case, you want to help them on the worst day of their life. And that requires lots of other things. It requires, empathy and compassion and listening, but it also requires us to be leaders, to help people navigate situations, and so I think those things are still going to be super present in healthcare in 2050.
So it doesn't sound like you're that worried about being or having your job taken over by a robot at this stage.
No, bring it on. Yeah. I want to get rid of that boring stuff and deal with the pointy end of what we do.
Would you still describe yourself as an educator today, or do you see yourself as more of an advocate? Do you think there's a tension there, or can you be both?
I'd like to think you can be both, although when you put that sent me that question, it rocked me a little bit, because I think it's a really good question. I think that my my growth through SMAC, my personal growth through SMAC and CODA, has very much made me feel more like an advocate than an educator. And I think they overlap. There's a Venn diagram with some overlapping domains, but they're probably a bit different, because advocacy really requires you to take up a position and to really try and champion that. And I don't think that's such a core feature of education. Education requires you to, as an academic, to understand the learning process and to see what needs to be learnt and to go and deliver that. And I think there is an overlap in the middle between those two. There'd be many people who advocate for education, but my process has gone sort of beyond normal education. I guess that the CODA's taken us in a direction that's much more around planetary health and ethics and other domains that are a bit sort of outside normal education.
For the audience that aren't really aware or across SMAC and CODA, I've certainly explained or given a good description of SMAC in our intro, but perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about the mission of CODA and where you've ended up with that now.
Yeah, okay. So we, as educators, I think when we had SMAC in Dublin and then in Berlin, we really felt like we'd made it, that we had got to where we were going, and it really made us question what we were to do next. You talked about change and was it addictive, and I guess in that sense we were like, what is going to happen? And amazingly, through those processes, particularly those conferences, the feedback was more and more into the area of those big questions that we touched on before. It was very much around things like, what's our role in healthcare as leaders, community leaders in planetary health? What's our role in ethics, and particularly gender inequity within healthcare, and how that affects our patients? These really big topics were coming through. And we felt that because of that tension you alluded to between being a medical education conference and then this real advocacy stuff that was coming through, that we really needed to sort of create a new purpose. And so that's why SMAC in 2019 was the end. And out of that was born CODA with a sort of new mission, which was around these pillars. And with still medical education tucked into it, but really a big focus on coming together to identify these big topics.
So you've cycled through, a range of different initiatives, and reinvention seems to be a part of the success of that sort of education revolution, as you see it. What's next?
Wow. Yeah. So for me personally, for me personally, probably, I'm entering a different stage of my own career now. For me is, approaching retirement in the next 5 to 10 years.
Good luck.
Yeah. If there's any doctors and nurses left, might be 20 years.
That's right.
But I think coming towards retirement, personally, I feel like there's this sort of exciting new phase, which is, how do I use everything that I've been given and exposed to and present for in the last 30 years of my career? How do I use those and in this last 10 years? For me, whether it was SMAC and CODA and education or my clinical medicine, I think like most healthcare professionals, I'm pretty passionate about what I do. And so it's about maintaining that passion. And I think where that is for me in the future is, in a leadership role, how do I continue to shine a light on all of these topics we've talked about today.
You've built a big community. How do you go about handing over the reins as you sort of move to maybe a different phase for your own personal development? How do you maintain momentum, not let the team down that you've built, this sort of followership? And are there people coming through now that you can sort of hand over the reins to?
So interesting, I think this is a big problem with COVID, is that within the healthcare sector globally, there is, really quite profound fatigue. And so I think it's a difficult time to hand over the reins completely of anything. But I also think, thinking outside the box, that there's other operations which are already going and started. There's operations that are in play outside of SMAC and CODA elsewhere around the world. Other groups not completely unrelated, because they may have been part of that, or they've certainly been exposed to that, but they're starting their own operations. So, we were fortunate enough with SMAC and CODA when we started it to start it as a complete charitable trust, listed in Australia. So there's still a fairly sizable amount of money and capital and knowledge within that
goodwill
that I think can be leveraged. And that's why, certainly we're not switching that off, but we are really open to people coming forward. Hopefully someone listens to this who's got an idea, because we've got an infrastructure, there's some financial support, etc., that we will look in the future to really support other groups to take the mantle forward.
So, your community have been, from the beginning of time, very avid users of social media and, Twitter and other new platforms. How can social media continue to sort of, I suppose, impact health education, health equity, create improvements for our patients? Are you seeing that will be a space that can further blossom, or do you think we're using it to its full potential now?
I doubt we're using it to its full potential. So I think, there's room for growth. I think the thing that's most beneficial about social channels is just the responsiveness. We've talked a lot about leaning into the conversation, about flattening the hierarchy. I mean, on Instagram or Twitter, it doesn't matter whether you're the professor of the George Institute or a nursing student, or it doesn't matter who you are. You've got a voice, and you can have an opinion, and you can put that forward, and hopefully it's respected and valued. So I think that space is a fantastic space, and we should then be bringing our patients, our clients, into that space.
Interesting.
Because that is an opportunity for those conversations to really dive a bit deeper, and for us to be enormously responsive. We don't have to wait a year to see what the next iteration is. You're getting instant feedback, and the responsiveness is so much faster.
So aside from waiting for the next sort of revolutionaries to come through and tap you for support and resources, is there any ongoing strategy from the group that have brought us SMAC and have brought us CODA to continue to widen these conversations and bring in, I suppose, the patient group, but more and more of our clinical colleagues, maybe some of our policymakers, because really if we could see that sort of collaboration that you created in that community filtering through so many other aspects of the health sector, it could only be a positive for the future. Can you see ways without these sort of massive performance pieces on an annual basis that we can really start to help to infiltrate that message?
Well, like podcast like this is an incredibly valuable tool, and it is getting taken up more and more. So I think there's a tangible sort of opportunity that we can create stuff that is free and open access and so readily accessible to anybody anytime. This sort of thing. I think podcasting is such a great space because it's just used in your own time. It can be listening to it on a 30-minute train trip. It's walking the dog. It's whatever. I think that's a fantastic space. But look, you're asking the wrong person, because I think for me, as a leader in that organisation, not many of the ideas have been mine. They've mostly been the delegates, and it's been about bringing those to fruition and surrounding yourself with opportunities for other people to be creative and create creative, trusting spaces for them. So you need to ask the audience rather than me.
And that sort of brings us really right back to how we create space in the institutions that we work in to allow for the exposition of that creativity in our everyday workspace. So we're creating the sort of mini communities that are doing this and feeling like they need to have the communication tool or maybe the anonymity of social media. I suppose giving people permission to bring that into institutions a little bit.
Yeah.
Am I reading that right from you?
Yeah, I think so. And I think bringing in, again, just, on that trust piece, it's about bringing in the ability to fail. I think that was so while you used a nice word, humility. I think humility across the organisation is a massively undervalued hard skill to acquire, and it's a very such a valuable skill because it creates this opportunity for people to feel, obviously, one, on the same level, but then two, if there's trust and humility, this opportunity to fail. And what I found was so rewarding through Smack and Coda was that when we got it wrong, the audience, really let us know, but in such a way that they completely forgave us at the same time, because they knew that, the only way you push the boundaries is by blowing up a few rockets on the way to the moon.
Yeah.
And, to use your marketing term, we jumped a few sharks.
Yeah.
If anyone watches Happy Days, they'll know what I'm talking about.
Dr. Roger Harris, thank you so much for the contribution you've made to education in the medical space, and thanks very much for being with us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Go ahead and like, share, or subscribe now so you don't miss a thing.